Hey friends, welcome back to Make Anything. I'm so sorry I didn't have a video for you last week, but to make it up for you this week, I'm gonna share my number one piece. Are you ready for it? It's literally the number one. And the reason I'm doing this is that I recently got a commission to do all these different numbers for the elevator lobbies of a living space in Los Angeles. So they want these giant numbers in all sorts of different art styles and looks, using all kinds of different techniques. And that variety is what got me excited and willing to accept the job, because I thought, it's gonna take up a lot of my time, but it's probably gonna be really cool, help me learn really fast, and they said I could share it with you as I go along the way. So I'm gonna be sharing my progress as I work on all of these numbers. I know it's a pretty random diversion from all the 3D printing I've been doing on my channel, but I'm really excited to master the CNC, and so this is gonna be a great project to do that. So today we're gonna get started on what I call the numbers project with the number one. Cool. Check this out. This is a little simulation hosted on GitHub. You can try it yourself, I'll put a link in the description. And this is what's known as a reaction diffusion simulation. It's actually a mathematical model that replicates the way chemicals interact and diffuse in real life. And this is what I used to create the pattern for my first number. I've been fascinated with this whole reaction diffusion system for a long time because it creates these fascinating, natural looking models. I would definitely recommend you check that out after this video and play around with it yourself, because it's just really satisfying. Anyways, I played around with this thing for quite a while. I took a bunch of screenshots and then I brought those into Adobe Illustrator so that I could test them out and see what they looked like on top of my number. I ended up with this particular pattern, and it was just a matter of moving it around until I liked the way it was arranged within this number one. So here's the layout that I ended up going with. And then I decided to just trace over the pattern and basically recreate it using the pen tool in Illustrator, which will help me create cleaner lines that will be easier to bring into Fusion 360 later once we convert this into a 3D object. So as I do this, I'm anticipating what it will be like cut out of wood and making sure that there aren't any tiny slivers of raised wood that would break off really easily, or just any parts that are too small. After a lot of tracing and then plenty of adjustments here and there to kind of make it look more organic again, I ended up with the final pattern that I'm happy with. And then what I did was export the outlines of the number itself as a DXF file, and then I also exported the squiggly pattern that I created as a separate DXF file. That way I could bring both of those into Fusion 360. So here we are in Fusion 360, and I'm basically gonna create the number exactly as I want it to look in real life. So I'm modeling this at scale. It's gonna be 3 feet tall. And then I'll go ahead and bring in that second DXF file with my pattern, and I'll use the extrude cut tool to cut into this virtual block of wood that I have. And then I'll go ahead and color the top faces just to get a closer simulation of what the end look I'm going for will be, since all of these top surfaces will be painted red. All right, that looks really cool. And now I just have to go ahead and round off some of these corners to make sure they won't be too sharp. I don't want it to be too easy to snag on people's clothing, and I also don't want very thin, sharp points that could easily break off. I have to make sure this is a nice, robust piece of art that will survive in a public space. So I'm just gonna select every little corner here around the edge and add a small fillet of 0.1 inches on each of these corners. All right, excellent. Now everything's rounded out, and this is pretty much exactly what I want my final shape to look like. Although I do have one big problem, and that's the fact that these are big numbers. My CNC has a maximum build area of 33 inches by 22.5 inches, so I can kind of simulate that by creating a box right here. And clearly, this number is not quite gonna fit onto my CNC as a single part. So to deal with that, I'm actually gonna have to cut this thing in half and make it as two separate parts. I thought the best way to do that would be to hide the split along one of these organic curves rather than just having a straight cut through the model. So I'll use this red line that's going right across about halfway through the one, and I'm gonna create a 0.1 millimeter offset and cut away that little sliver to split this model into two parts. All right, there we go. It's now into two parts, and I actually could fit this all onto one single bed now, although just because I'm not too experienced with this, I ended up splitting this up into two separate jobs so that I'll do one half of the number first, and then I'll do the other half, just so if I make a mistake, I don't ruin everything, just half of it. From there, I went through and figured out the machining settings. You can actually program this for the CNC in Fusion 360 as well. It's a very robust program, although just like in the past, I'm gonna kind of skip through this part because I'm far from an expert and I don't think I would provide too much helpful information just yet. Although if you are interested in the manufacturing workspace of Fusion 360, let me know in the comments. If enough of you want to see it, sure enough, I'll go ahead and go into more detail in future videos. But for now, we're gonna go ahead and get physical. To start out, I'm just gonna do a small test on plywood, just because I haven't done anything quite like this before, so I don't wanna go straight into possibly destroying my final piece. And one of the coolest tricks that you guys shared with me in the comments of my last CNC video is that instead of dealing with all these different clamps to hold my wood in place, you can just put masking tape on the piece as well as on the cutting surface and then super glue those together. I love that. It saves a lot of time and setup, and it leaves the piece completely free floating, so you don't have to worry about accidentally running into a clamp or something as you run the CNC. So this cut that you're seeing is the first of two processes that are combined to create the final piece. First, I did this outline cut with a flat end mill, and then I'll swap it out with this rounded end mill so that I can do the pattern. And that's simply a matter of preference. I want the inner edges that are being cut out to be rounded, and that's exactly what this end mill will do. So here it is, cutting out the pattern 1 millimeter at a time. So it's really just like the exact opposite of a 3D printer. Instead of building up one layer at a time, it cuts away one layer at a time. The test piece finished up with no problems whatsoever, and because I just used that super glue and masking tape technique, it was really easy to take my piece off afterwards, and there's very little cleanup. So that's really one of my favorite new CNC tricks. I also decided to do one more test print, and this is a little tolerance test that I created, which basically has a little key and several different holes, each with a different amount of clearance, from 0 millimeters to 0.35 millimeters. I tested each of them out and discovered that a 0.1 millimeter clearance is exactly what I need to create a really nice tight fit. So that's what I'm going to use for now whenever I need to create two parts that slide in and fit perfectly together. Alright, so now that I'm pretty confident with my CNC, the next thing I have to do is build the stock, or the raw wood piece that I'm going to cut my pattern out of. And instead of just having a huge sheet of wood, I'm trying to be economical here and use as little wood as possible. So I'm actually going to first construct a rough version of that hole number 1, just with a slightly wider border, and then I'll cut my shape out of that with the CNC after the fact. So that means some good old-fashioned woodworking, which I'm not exactly an expert at. I definitely ended up with several burnt pieces of wood just because I was trying to cut too fast. But nevertheless, I did end up with the pieces I needed. After cutting the pieces of wood down, I am going to want to plane the pieces so that they're all nice and flat and the same thickness. But before I got to that, I noticed several cracks in my wood. And to prevent them from expanding, I'm going to fill them with some of the thin Starbond glue, which really seeps in all those cracks. Here on the side of the piece of wood, you can see how that super glue basically soaks all the way through and really fills all the little cracks that I have in this wood. By the way, I'm using alder wood here. It's pretty much the cheapest and most accessible hardwood here in Southern California. And it's pretty nice, but unfortunately the pieces I got did have quite a few cracks like this. So I did have to fill all of those up with super glue. But once that was dried, I went ahead and took everything to the planer and started shaving them down. This planer isn't meant to handle pieces shorter than 12 inches, but by stacking them together like this, I was able to safely feed them through. I went ahead and fed all the pieces of wood through over and over again until they were all nice and completely flat. And I just put a new blade on this planer, so it's a really clean, smooth surface. Now the sides of the wood are still a bit rough, so before gluing them together, I'm gonna sand this down on this little sanding table I created. It's basically 4 different grits of sandpaper, which I stuck down to this piece of wood using spray mount. And that created a nice flat surface that I could sand against and quickly get these parts really smooth. With that done, it's time to glue these things together. So I'll slop on a bunch of wood glue and clamp the pieces into place. Now these 2 pieces are a bit more challenging because of this weird angle. And to deal with that, I decided to build a quick little jig. So I'm gonna trace this corner and cut that out on the table saw, and then use that to give myself a better clamping surface. There we go. Not perfect, but it did a pretty good job. I just had to add a few more clamps on the side to hold everything flat down on the table. Here we are the next day. The glue is dry, and now we're able to continue working. So I'll rip off this wax paper that I laid down, and then I'll just do a bit more sanding to make sure all these seams are really smooth and seamless. Now it's painting time. Here I've got some nice high quality Sherwin-Williams paint, and I'll use a dense foam roller to get a nice flat surface coverage on the top surfaces of all these pieces. The coverage was really good after 1 coat, but just to make sure this is nice and robust, I went ahead and did about 3 coats, 15 minutes apart. And after that's all dry, I'm gonna go ahead and go over it with some spray polyurethane. I'll be applying more of this stuff once the number is completely done, but this coat here is specifically for the purpose of getting a cleaner cut on the CNC. Since this is a latex paint, it's a bit rubbery, a bit stretchy, so by putting this polyurethane coat on top, it'll get a little harder and more brittle, and therefore when I cut into it with the CNC, it should give me a cleaner cut. So back at the CNC, I'm gonna lay down a new piece of sacrificial material on the bed. I'm gonna cover the entire CNC surface with this compression board, just so that I have something to cut into, since we're gonna be cutting the numbers completely out. So I went ahead and used that super glue and masking tape trick again. Love it. And I wanted to do one final test, since I hadn't actually cut into the alder wood just yet. So here I am cutting a little corner of my pattern into this piece of scrap wood, and sure enough, it came out looking quite fantastic. So let's get to the real thing. I'll start with the bottom piece, position it perpendicular to the CNC, and then I'll just trace out the position, put on that masking tape, and do that whole super glue shindig again. And once that's all glued down and fastened, I'll go ahead and zero my CNC to the corner of this stock. I printed this little guide to help me zero the bit right to the corner. And then before doing any actual cutting, I did one last measure of running this process, which basically just moves along the outline of the cut so that I can make sure that my piece is positioned fine and I won't just be cutting in thin air later on. Looks like I positioned it really well, so there's nothing left to do but zero in that end mill and start the first process. So this time around, I'm cutting out the pattern first, and then I'll switch the end mill and cut the outline afterwards. All right, there it goes. And it's interesting to watch how it starts the cut by slowly spiraling down. And it does that in order to create a nice clean edge. Here you can see the UC CNC software that I'm running this operation on, and it looks very antiquated and complicated, but there's not really too much to it. And it's pretty nice because you can preview every command and you can watch the toolpath on the computer and make sure everything's working the way it's supposed to. Now I just have to let the program run its course and hope there aren't any problems. And unfortunately, I didn't find any way to preview the amount of time that this cut would take. I was thinking it might take 3 hours, but it ended up closer to 6.5 hours. So I basically stayed up all night watching this thing do its thing. Luckily, my Stepcraft 840 CNC completed all of the cuts with no problems. And then after a little bit of cleanup, I went ahead and switched out the tool bit manually. So I'm just gonna go ahead and pull it out, take out that flat end mill, replace it with the round end mill, and then make sure that the 0 position is still the same right in that corner. And then I'll run the second part of this operation, which is the 2-dimensional contour that cuts the entire outline of this number. This part was a lot quicker because it's just a single outline, and I was also going down 2 millimeters at a time instead of 1 millimeter like I was doing with the pattern. This part took about 1 hour, so all in all, it was about 7.5 hours of cutting to make this half of my number. Once it was done, I was able to pry this part off of the masking tape and admire those edges. It's a pretty clean cut. There's definitely some raised grain, and I'm not sure if that's just a matter of my settings or just the quality of the wood, but I was happy with it. So on to the second part, which, well, we can skip through that because it's exactly the same. So I'd call that a total success on the CNC, and while the machine does a great job of making those clean cuts, I did go back in with some sandpaper and do a bit of manual sanding to just clean up some of the edges. There were some edges here and there where the paint didn't cut completely with the wood, but with just a light sanding, I was able to clean that up. Some of the rounded corners on the inside also had quite a bit of grain sticking out, so I went in there and sanded that away as well. Although I actually like the lines that the CNC left on the bottom surface of the pattern, so I tried to keep those there instead of sanding them away. I also noticed some more cracks that I had to fill with super glue, so even though it created some unsightly spots on the outside, I'd rather have the part not crack and break off later down the road, so I'll just go ahead and fill those cracks with some more of that thin Starbond super glue. Now that I've cleaned up my parts, it's time to glue them together and make them one. I've got these nice 5-foot clamps which will help me press this thing together from the top and bottom. And I'll put some cardboard there to protect the edges, slop on the glue, and then go ahead and compress it. 24 hours later, the glue has hardened and we have our single piece. Now I'll just flip it over and scrape off some of that excess glue, sand it flat, and now we can do our final coats of polyurethane. So I'll set my number upright. I put a little bit of double stick tape on the bottom edge just to make sure it doesn't slip away. And then I'll go ahead and do several passes with this polyurethane spray. The spray can works a lot better when it's upright, so that's why I have it standing up. And I think I did 5 coats with 15 minutes between each coat. After 72 hours, that polyurethane is dry, and it really brought out some richness in the wood. I'm really happy with the overall look of this piece. It's just super clean, and I can't say I've ever seen anything quite like it. All right, so that's what it took for me to make this giant number 1. I gotta say, this is actually the number 1 thing I've made on the CNC so far, because it's really cool looking. I love the contrast of the paint with the wood. The technique of painting first and cutting it out after, it worked really great. There's a little bit of raised grain here. This is one of those things that you could really sand forever and just keep getting more and more perfect. But I think it's in a really good condition for a public art piece. And I'm super excited to put the mounting hardware on the back of this, get it up on the wall, and well, before that I gotta make about 25 more of these things. So that's what you'll probably be seeing in most of the upcoming videos, is just making all sorts of different numbers using different techniques. I know it's super random, like why would you want to watch me make numbers? What do you need numbers for? But beyond the actual end piece, I think there's a lot to be learned just from the techniques that I'm using and from all the things I'm learning along the way. Anyways, that's gonna be it for this week's video. I hope you'll stay tuned, hope you're subscribed so you can see all the awesome other numbers that I'll be coming up with some very different techniques. So keep an eye out, and that's it for today. Until next time, I'm Devin, this is Make Anything, and as always, stay inspired.